For 4 years, we were all captivated. The rolling hills east of the Pennines were subjected to some of the best football in Europe, a tag usually reserved for the Red Rose empires of Anfield and Old Trafford. The sleeping giant, birthed by the management of Don Revie and matured from its adolescence by Howard Wilkinson, had been reawakened by the youth under David O'Leary. They tussled with the superstars of their time, Ferguson's Manchester United and Wenger's Arsenal back home, before the Ballon d'Or winning stars of Rivaldo, Andriy, Shevchenko and Figo graced the hallowed turf of Elland Road. They came so close to conquering it all, to planting another Leeds United flag of success into the turf. Yet underneath the surface was a reckless and ruinous regime that threatened the very fabric of the club. This is the story of Leeds United's boom and bust at the turn of the millennium, when West Yorkshire dared to live the dream and, in the end, flew a little too close to the sun. Leeds United may well have been formed in 1919 after the disbanding of Leeds City during the First World War owing to illegal payments paid to players, but they may as well have been formed when Don Revie arrived in 1961. They lived under the empirical shadows of those from all angles: Manchester United, Liverpool and Everton to the west, Newcastle and Sunderland to the east, Sheffield Wednesday to the south, and even local rivals Huddersfield Town. They rarely, if ever, challenged for the top title, and their best ever in the Cup was a quarter-final performance in 1950. Players such as John Charles had come and gone without too much long-term impact at Elland Road. Then Don Revie turned up, dressed the club in white in the hope that their new colours, the same as Real Madrid, would result in some kind of success. Born and raised in Middlesbrough, Revie found football alluring and would turn out for his hometown club before finding fame as one of the game's first false nines at Manchester City, where he won the Football Writers' Footballer of the Year in 1955. 3 years later, he arrived at Leeds. 3 years beyond that, he was promoted to the role of manager. Results on the pitch didn't inspire much hope as the club slipped to an all-time low of 19th in the second division, and attendances similarly declined. Club chairman Harry Reynolds was willing to be patient, however, as Don Revie set about revitalising the club through the means of youth recruitment. They couldn't offer the same financial packages as Liverpool or Manchester United, nor were they still basking in the afterglow of European Cup participation like Burnley or Ipswich Town. Revie retired from playing in 1963 to focus solely on building Leeds United. He created the club off the back of dietary requirements, ballet dancers at top poise and balance, as well as bringing an edge to their play. Jack Charlton and Norman Hunter were abrasive in defence, Billy Bremner, Bobby Collins and Johnny Giles tireless in midfield, whilst Eddie Gray and Peter Lorimer scored the goals. They formed the second division champions in 1964 and would steer the course in the top flight. Revie was no flash in the pan. The club was financially stable, retained belief in their youth prospects, and once in the top flight, Revie's Leeds would not be shifted from the top four. The club reached their first cup final in 1965, losing to Bill Shankly's Liverpool, before repeating the trick in the 1967 Fairs Cup final against Dinamo Zagreb. Thanks to the 30 goals of Peter Lorimer in the 1967-68 season, it proved another watershed. The League Cup final win over Arsenal, the first major piece of silverware. Quickly followed was the Fairs Cup triumph over Ferencváros. The club was sensible, promoting Eddie Gray, Mick Bates and Terry Yorath from the academy, whilst rare splurges of cash were spent on Mick Jones and Alan Clark. Revie's success proved unpopular nationwide, but long-term, the league was finally won in 1969 before a treble charge the season after resulted in 2 excruciating silver medals in the league and cup before being undone against an experienced Celtic in a European Cup semi-final. Juventus were beaten in the 1971 Fairs Cup final, Arsenal in the following year's FA Cup final, and Revie ended his dynasty with a second title in 1974. From a hot streak, just 2 Fairs Cups, a League Cup, an FA Cup and 2 league titles was an underachievement. Leeds were denounced as dirty Leeds, but of equal measure was the misfortune and foundations built on silver as opposed to gold. They missed out on FA Cups to Liverpool, Chelsea and Sunderland, a Fairs Cup to Dinamo Zagreb, a UEFA Cup to Milan, and league titles by less than a game's worth of points to Manchester United in 1965, Arsenal in 1971 and Derby County in 1972. They also collected silver in the league in the World Cup years of 1966 and 1970. The most egregious misfortune came after Don Revie's departure. In 1975, it was a pure travesty that Bayern Munich were allowed to walk away from the European Cup final with the trophy. By that point, the loyalty of a band of players had dissolved with the nightmarish 44-day reign of Brian Clough. As quickly as Leeds ascended to the club game's biggest contest, they were plunged into the wilderness. 6 top-half finishes followed the European Cup final, but the top 4 that came so easily under Revie was unattainable. In 1982, they were relegated. A combination of big names in Jock Stein and Brian Clough couldn't match Revie's glories, neither his former players Alan Clark, Billy Bremner or Eddie Gray. Their first of many failed playoff campaigns ended in defeat to Charlton Athletic in a third game in 1987. Behind the scenes though, work was being done in bringing the club back to the big time. Eddie Gray was now employed to bring the youth through, and the likes of John Lukic and Gary Speed were brought through the ranks and would blossom under the reign of Howard Wilkinson. Appointed in October 1988, Wilkinson met Leeds United near the bottom of the second tier. He came armed with a 10-year plan to create a production line of world-class homegrown talent with shades of Revie about it, as well as achieving promotion. In 1990, both the Thorpe Arch training ground was opened and the club returned to the top flight after 8 years away. Gordon Strachan's volley against Leicester City set the wheels in motion for promotion before a triumph against Sheffield United confirmed Leeds' return. 2 years later, thanks to the instrumental midfield of Strachan alongside David Batty, Gary Speed and Gary McAllister, Leeds became champions of England for the third time. Lukic kept goal and Eric Cantona led the line, if briefly, yet it was a signal of intent. But it wouldn't last. Leeds bowed out of the Champions League's first edition in a 2-legged Battle of Britain against Rangers. Then things got worse. Poor away form and the sale of Eric Cantona contributed to a 17th place finish in the first season of the Premier League. The exodus began. Batty, Strachan, Speed as well as Tony Dorigo all exited in quick succession. As Leeds United disappointingly set up shop as one of the Premier League's also-rans and appeared at Wembley for the last time in a losing League Cup final against Aston Villa, there was finally improvement. The Grange was opened in 1994 to nurture the players of tomorrow. Howard Wilkinson, though, would never be around to personally bear the fruits of his own work, sacked in September 1996, mere months after returning Leeds to Wembley. The following year, the Youth Cup was won. Goalkeeper Paul Robinson, defender Jonathan Woodgate, midfielder Stephen McPhail, wonder kid Harry Kewell and frontman Alan Smith all starred. Within 2 years, they'd all be firm fixtures of the senior team. Another footnote of equal importance came out of Elland Road in 1997. A certain local businessman and lifelong Leeds United fan, Peter Ridsdale, became chairman. There he met George Graham, the new manager. A man of experience, he'd claimed 2 league titles whilst at Arsenal, a cup double in the Premier League's first year of existence, and had earned a European honour whilst in North London with the 1994's winning of the Cup Winners' Cup. However, he came to West Yorkshire in disgrace, in full rehabilitation mode after he allegedly accepted a bung and was subsequently banned by the FA. Renowned for his defensive football at Arsenal, George Graham delivered a similarly dull yet solid brand of football to Elland Road. His first campaign saw just 28 league goals scored in a typically safe mid-table performance before a top 5 finish for only the 6th time since Don Revie had left 24 years prior. During Graham's time, only Harry Kewell out of Leeds' vibrant academy class would be trusted with regular senior minutes. It is something that cost youth coach Paul Hart his job, whilst other youth coach Eddie Gray and Graham's assistant were adamant that the club's youth stars were ready for the Premier League. 6 matches into the 1998-99 season, Leeds United were unbeaten when their manager's head was turned by a mid-table Tottenham Hotspur, when Christian Gross was sacked as manager. George Graham's final Leeds outing would be at, of all places, White Hart Lane and an atypical 3-3 draw for the dour team. He returned to London officially for family reasons, but in his categorisation of Spurs as a wealthy club in comparison to Leeds, it was all the inspiration needed for his departure, and for the abuse he would subsequently receive from his former club supporters. In fact, his conclusion wasn't completely true. Spurs had the 5th lowest net spend since the Premier League began 6 years prior, whilst Leeds United had spent £20 million to be one of the division's highest spenders. Spurs would pay $3 million to relieve George Graham of his Yorkshire surroundings, only $1.7 million less than the club had spent in the prior 6 years. He was all set to take his assistant manager down to North London with him, where it all started for the pair. However, he had other ideas, not wishing to be associated with Spurs after a distinguished playing career with Arsenal. Also, he'd settled in Yorkshire, recently praised for his heroics when prizing the emergency door of an aeroplane open after a crash landing less than a year prior. The assistant would become the Leeds United caretaker, whilst a suitable successor was found. At his disposal was a solid team built from the back in the image of the club's former manager, from Nigel Martin in goal, Lucas Radebe and Gary Kelly in defence, and the industrious Lee Bowyer in midfield. This, combined with the bargain binds of Gunnar Halle, Alpha Haaland and David Hopkin, made Leeds a no-frills machine. It was now David O'Leary's job to add some zest to proceedings. Except David O'Leary didn't want the job and Leeds United didn't want him to have the job. They longed for Martin O'Neill, whose spectre stood incredibly close after a victory against Leeds in O'Leary's first game in caretaker charge. The Leicester City manager, however, announced his desire to remain at Filbert Street that left both O'Leary and Leeds chairman Peter Ridsdale with a decision to make. O'Leary wanted financial reassurances from Ridsdale that he could build a healthy squad, reassurances that he received. Despite 3 Premier League draws on the spin and a UEFA Cup elimination to Roma, O'Leary had signalled his intentions by throwing on the youth prospects of Jonathan Woodgate and Stephen McPhail whilst playing attacking football. With the supporters on side, another popular move was to install Eddie Gray as assistant manager. It would take the new regime a little over a month to win a football match, a 2-1 league victory at home to Sheffield Wednesday via Jonathan Woodgate's first goal for the club. In the meantime, Leeds bowed out of the League Cup at the hands of Leicester City, their bogey team of the time who would force their elimination twice in as many years. However, the highlight of O'Leary's young reign in West Yorkshire came next, at Anfield, when Leeds were incisive on the break and a young Alan Smith made his debut and scored with his first ever touch of a Premier League football in a tremendous 3-1 victory. It was a goal and a victory that came with an ounce of luck. Both the debutant Smith and Jonathan Woodgate shouldn't have been on the pitch but on England under-18s duty. However, when their match with Israel was postponed on political grounds, they were recalled by their club, and the rest is history. Smith didn't wait long for his second Leeds goal, whilst Jimmy Floyd Hasselbank kept up his rich vein of form in front of goal with a 4-1 battering at home to Charlton Athletic. That winning run though came to an end in their next contest, a 3-2 defeat at the eventual treble winners Manchester United. It was a match where Paul Robinson was thrown in at the deep end. He'd made his Premier League debut the prior month in a man of the match display and keeping a clean sheet against Chelsea. Here his first act was to pick the ball out of the net. Still, Leeds played well and were only dispatched by a stunning late Nicky Butt goal. Prior to the defeat, Alex Ferguson remarked, "It's already clear that O'Leary is intent on bringing his own ideals to bear at Elland Road. It's refreshing to see because he's doing the game a service and I hope his beliefs work out. I have seen young coaches trying to change football only to find the realities of the game changing them, which is always a shame. There is no doubt the game can change you. Let's hope not in the case of David O'Leary." The rebound was stark, a 4-0 thrashing of West Ham United at Elland Road where Hasselbank netted for the 6th game in a row. It was also a contest that featured 7 Leeds players 21 or under, with 6 of those coming from the academy. Later that night on Match of the Day, coupled with their brilliant display, it earned Leeds the comparison with the Busby Babes and a seat at the conversation for Champions League table qualification. Of course, to qualify for the Champions League, Leeds had to finish in the top 3, and to do so against the likes of Chelsea, Liverpool and Aston Villa, they also needed experience. Experience is what they received when David Batty waived a payout from his Newcastle United contract to return to Elland Road at the age of 30. Alongside Hasselbank, another clinical goalscorer was needed, but Leeds United remained sensible in the market. Dion Dublin and Pierre van Hooijdonk were passed on owing to their large transfer fee demands. Peter Ridsdale was unwilling to meet their figures, stating, "We have to make sure that our spending is at the right level so that we can continue to invest in the future." Nonetheless, Hasselbank continued to reign in goals, averaging 1 a game from O'Leary's first league triumph over Wednesday right up until their 3-0 thrashing of Newcastle United at St James's Park on Boxing Day 7 weeks later. Unfortunately, a glut of injuries contributed to a poor start to 1999, with the FA Cup 5th round hurdle of Tottenham Hotspur too large after a replay. However, a Hasselbank brace at a wilting Aston Villa kick-started the European dream once again. 6 victories followed, whilst a front four of Alan Smith, Jimmy Floyd Hasselbank, Harry Kewell and Lee Bowyer had all become automatic picks. The manager of the month, curse-struck David O'Leary after a hard-fought 0-0 draw at home to Liverpool was combined with the drop points of Charlton Athletic. The title hopes, faint enough already with the might of Chelsea, Arsenal and Manchester United ahead of them, were evaporated. Not evaporated, however, was Leeds' spirit, as they held Manchester United to a point before another 5 goals were put beyond West Ham. Whilst the 3-month unbeaten run came to an end at the title-chasing Chelsea, Leeds had secured European football once again. Their 18th and final league triumph of the season was the most seismic of the lot and arguably O'Leary's greatest victory. Hasselbank netted on 86 minutes at home to Arsenal in the final week of the season. However, it was bittersweet, as it all but sealed the first of 3 trophies for bitter rivals Manchester United. Pride could be taken from half of the PFA Young Player of the Year awards field coming from the club, Bowyer, Smith and Kewell all shortlisted for an accolade eventually won by Nicolas Anelka of Arsenal. Kewell, however, would take the honour in 12 months' time. It was a solid foundation built upon further that summer with a clear idea in David O'Leary's mind. He wanted 4 additions with a young British talent that adhered to the dynamism already in the squad. Eric Bakker was a bonus in midfield. Danny Mills from Charlton and Michael Dewberry from Chelsea added options in defence, whilst Michael Bridges was a bright prospect at £5 million from Sunderland. Unfortunately, the last piece of the puzzle, purportedly Kieran Dyer, proved too expensive, and Jimmy Floyd Hasselbank couldn't refuse the type of money Atletico Madrid were offering. At £12 million, neither could Leeds United. In response, O'Leary signed the Quicksilver Darren Huckabee from Coventry. O'Leary tried to temper expectations by saying that anybody who thinks we will win the Premiership this year and the European Cup the next is not living in the real world. Yet they were installed as 4th favourites for the league behind the duopoly of Arsenal and United, as well as a resurgent Chelsea who had grown to be a capable team under Gianluca Vialli. After an understandable loss at Old Trafford and a tricky home defeat to Liverpool, an early highlight was getting one over on George Graham at White Hart Lane before the goals finally flowed. 18 were bagged in the next 7 league games where only 2 points were dropped. Leeds were on the march. They were top of the league, boosted by investment from B-Sky B, who had bought 10% of the club, as well as a sponsorship deal with Strongbow. They'd also sailed through in the UEFA Cup, with potentially tricky trips to Belgrade and Moscow navigated. Whilst a loss at Wimbledon momentarily knocked them off top spot, the defensive foundation of Gary Kelly, Lucas Radovich, Jonathan Woodgate and Ian Hart began to shine, acquiring 5 clean sheets in 2 months before the year was out. Chelsea manager Gianluca Vialli lauded Leeds after they had won at Stamford Bridge with a Stephen McPhail double, stating, "They're not scared of anything. This afternoon they kept cool, they waited and they scored. All these things combined to make them a team capable of winning the title." They even navigated a postponed UEFA Cup tie after a 3rd round return to Moscow was postponed after a frozen pitch at Spartak. A rearranged tie in Sofia coupled with a return leg home win confirmed Leeds' place in Europe for after Christmas. The club attempted to forget about David Batty's prolonged injury layoff by procuring the experience of Jason Wilcox, a Premier League winner with Blackburn, but Batty's absence would be keenly felt. They were outclassed at Highbury, but that couldn't dampen the spirits as Manchester United's draw up at Sunderland confirmed Leeds as the leaders of the Premier League as the 20th century became the 21st. In 1999, nobody had gained more points than them in the league. Then the night in which the long-term mood around the club hinged on. Had Leeds progressed in the League Cup against Leicester City, they would have had a game on the night where the players were given a night out to let their hair down. What had been planned as a harmless night out turned into the serious assault of a young student in the city centre. Jonathan Woodgate, Lee Bowyer and Michael Dewberry would be sucked into multiple court cases, a retrial and a verdict that split members of the team apart and created a divide between some players and the manager. It would rumble on for years. 2000 started horrifically. Aston Villa secured a win at Elland Road and eliminated them a month later in the FA Cup before a loss at Anfield removed Leeds from the top of the Premiership pile. They had a chance to claw back that deficit, however, when Manchester United pitched up at Elland Road for one of those purposely prohibitive 11:30am kickoffs introduced in the early 2000s. A win would bind both United's level in the table. In a match of fine margins, Lee Bowyer blazed a simple chance over the bar and Andy Cole slotted in the winner. With the gap now 6 points, a stalemate at Riverside the following week left Leeds' title hopes hanging by a thread. Once again they rebounded against clubs circling the drain, Coventry, Bradford and Wimbledon, as Europe helped focus the team's minds. Harry Kewell's winner gained revenge over Roma in the fourth round and Slavia Prague were demolished in the quarter-final. Then the season crumbled. In advance of a trip to Istanbul for a UEFA Cup semi-final against Galatasaray, Leeds' form dipped with their poor record at Filbert Street continuing and Chelsea sneaking of a victory at Elland Road. Then tragedy struck when the lives of Leeds supporters Christopher Loftus and Kevin Speight were taken far too soon. Much less significant was the subsequent elimination to the Turkish side and a run of 5 winless games in the league that dented Champions League aspirations. Finally, the fixture list fell kindly and 7 points gained from the relegated Sheffield Wednesday and Watford as well as against Everton left Leeds with a chance come the final game. Luckily, Gerard Houllier's Liverpool had collapsed to a David Weatherall winner at Valley Parade that, in turn, saved Bradford City and gifted Champions League football to Leeds. Looking back, the improvement of 1 place and 2 points appears incremental. However, with the experience acquired both on and off the pitch, it had put the club in good stead ahead of a first Champions League campaign. The young squad had only just begun to realise their potential, yet with a European semi-final reached and a top 3 finish achieved with just 18 outfield players used, it was clear that Leeds United needed reinforcements. Olivier Dacour was quickly added for grit in midfield, whilst David O'Leary earmarked a new striker and a left-back as his targets. Emile Heskey, Andriy Flo and Carl Cort were added to the now long list of desired centre-forwards in which Leeds failed to sign before finally conjuring up the money for Celtic's Mark Viduka. Ultimately, it was a signing that initially failed to inspire after he announced that he was to postpone his debut in order to play in the Sydney Olympics. Whilst an out-and-out left-back wasn't signed, despite the heavy interest in John Arnorisa, the left-footed centre-half Dominic Matteo was purchased from Liverpool and could fill in on the left or in midfield if required. However, with the trimming of the squad's fat and the departures of Alfie Haaland, David Hopkin and Robert Molinar, it meant that Leeds had a smaller squad than what they had the prior season. The season began not with the sunshine opening day of league football, but a comfortable victory made nervy by an away goal for 1860 Munich. The Germans were, adjudged by the seedings, the most difficult opponent that Leeds could be drawn in Champions League qualification. Without Harry Kewell, Jonathan Woodgate, Stephen McPhail and Jason Wilcox to go with long-term absentee David Batty, Leeds were made to sweat for their qualification. Nigel Martin had the game of his life to ensure Leeds took the lead into Germany, and Alan Smith's first leg winner ultimately split the pair. Leeds were group stage bound, whilst the Bavarian outfit were eliminated. The Champions League couldn't have started in more esteemed climes than the Camp Nou, where not even the pre-match prayers of Gary Kelly and Stephen McPhail were answered in a nearby chapel as they were smashed 4-0. It had been an inconsistent start to the season, potentially drained by pre-qualifying for Europe as the Whites were defeated by newly promoted Manchester City and Ipswich Town before dropping points at the eventually relegated Coventry City. A shining light, however, was Alan Smith, who had hit the ground running with 5 goals to start the season. The most memorable strike of the early season, however, came with a helping hand from Milan's Dida, who fumbled Lee Bowyer's tame effort into the net at Elland Road. Despite the buoyancy that a win over the 5-time European champions brought, injury would become a recurring theme, as Michael Dewberry's season was ended 6 matches into the league in a disappointing draw at Pride Park. But the floodgates soon opened. Mark Viduka and Dominic Matteo bagged their first club goals in a 6-0 Champions League triumph over Besiktas. Viduka and Smith would evenly share 4 more in a topsy-turvy slaying of Spurs before the Australians smashed in 2 more goals to beat Charlton. Then the harrowing return to Istanbul, where a young Leeds squad that averaged just 22 years of age were happy to escape with a 0-0. Yet it was a result plagued by more injury, as Michael Bridges called time on his season after a knee injury. Also, there was the fact that Paul Robinson was adequately deputising for Nigel Martin, who had torn his thigh. Regardless of the stockpiling of players in the physio's room, both Robinson and Woodgate were instrumental in a 1-1 draw against Barcelona. A match which started perfectly with a Lee Bowyer free kick turned sour with a late Rivaldo equaliser. It left Leeds still needing a point from the San Siro. Just as the Premier League had started to heat up, and Leeds had become hot under the collar after being consummately beaten at Old Trafford and couldn't even take all 3 points away from Valley Parade. Then the match of the season, and Mark Viduka's highlight in a white shirt. Viduka 4, Liverpool 3, in a terrific contest where Leeds constantly had to fight back from a deficit and fight back from yet another long-term injury when Jonathan Woodgate hobbled off. Before Leeds could think about further enormous matches against title rivals Chelsea and Arsenal, there was the small matter of a San Siro trip. A point for Milan confirmed the group, a point for Leeds confirmed qualification, and a draw is what both received. Serginho equalised Dominic Matteo's most famous Leeds moment following a Shevchenko missed penalty. Therefore, everybody got what they wanted. 14 days split the first and second group phases, and Leeds began the second phase as they did the first, with a daunting opposition from El Clasico. Between the 2 phases, Leeds had failed to win, and with a midfield 3 of Lee Bowyer, Jacob Burns and Dominic Matteo, did well to keep the score down to a 2-0 loss against the European champions. A third trip to Rome in as many years was next, but this time Leeds won out through a late Alan Smith strike. It was a performance that had England purring. Glenn Hoddle stated it was one of the best English performances in Europe for a generation. Between December the 5th and February the 13th, Leeds would have no more European distractions and were coming off the back of a superb 1-0 victory over Arsenal owing to an Olivier Dacour goal. They were also bleeding in another signing, Rio Ferdinand, for a defensive record £18 million, the majority of which was accounted for in Leeds' progression to the last 16 of the Champions League. It bloated the club's spending under David O'Leary to £65 million. Just as 2000 started badly, however, so too it ended badly, with 3 points picked up from 5 matches. Defeats as far north as Newcastle and as far south as Southampton prompted a switch-up in attack. Robbie Keane signed and an underperforming Darren Huckabee shipped off to Manchester City. The much-promised Leeds United title push was officially over before Christmas. They sat a staggering 18 points behind Manchester United and were marooned in 14th place before yet another present was gifted in the form of a 2-month Harry Kewell layoff. In 1999, Leeds had the most Premier League points. In 2000, they had lost more than they won. Yet 2001 started brightly, with the only hiccup at home to Newcastle United in the league and an unfortunate 4th-round cup exit lost late on to Liverpool. Elsewhere though, Leeds hit their stride at the perfect time with the Champions League's resumption around the corner. Robbie Keane was named Player of the Month for January and netted 5 in as many matches as Leeds leapt from mid-table obscurity and into the top 6. A dramatic late comeback saw off Anderlecht to Elland Road before 8 days later in Brussels, Leeds had the match won by the time Alan Smith netted his second and Leeds' third. With a trip to the Bernabeu and the visit of Lazio to come, Leeds had already qualified via their head-to-head superiority over Anderlecht. In the meantime, Leeds had sweetly ended George Graham's Spurs reign with a 2-1 triumph at White Hart Lane and found themselves once again unlucky to only come away with a point at home to Manchester United. David O'Leary believed the gap was closing to Man United, stating, "We are going into the last part of the season and I think we are getting stronger." He had promoted former Manchester United legend Brian Kidd from running the academy to become his assistant manager, so he could step back from day-to-day coaching, a move which would have ramifications later on down the line. For now though, all was well. A good showing in Madrid ultimately resulted in a spirited 3-2 defeat, whilst another 3 goals shipped against Lazio was an entertaining conclusion to the long-winded group phase. Meanwhile, Leeds remained unbeaten in the league, Viduka and Smith making quite the double act as they converged on 2 away wins to end March in the 3rd and final Champions League spot. Speaking of the Champions League, the knockout phase was on the horizon. Perhaps the best chance Leeds had of qualification was to win the competition itself. First up in the quarter-finals was a return to Spain to meet the Spanish champions, Deportivo La Coruña. Depor had collected the same amount of points from their La Liga triumph in 2000 than Leeds had done from a bronze medal in the Premier League. In fact, they had shared identical records of 21 wins, 6 draws and 11 defeats. In the 4 games against Spanish opposition that season, Leeds had drawn 1 and lost the other 3, yet they destroyed Deportivo, with a 3-0 scoreline flattering the Spaniards. The winning margin, large by the standards of the day in the Champions League, didn't necessarily mean one foot in the semi-finals. Depor were the comeback kings of Europe. Less than a month ago, they had overturned PSG's 3-goal lead at the Riazor inside 27 balmy minutes. After conceding a 9th-minute penalty, the same fate could have befallen Leeds, yet they clung on to secure a victory-smelling 2-goal defeat. For the first time since 1975, Leeds were semi-finalists in Europe's greatest club competition. Domestically, the wins kept coming via Southampton and Liverpool, which opened up a gap between the latter and Leeds for that 3rd and final Champions League berth. The goal which rejuvenated an already great season for Liverpool, however, spun on a controversial winner from a once-beloved son of Elland Road. Gary McAllister was in the Indian summer of his career and netted a controversial free-kick winner in the Merseyside derby that left Liverpool 3 points behind Leeds with a game in hand and the superior goal difference with 4 to play. The ball was in their court. With Europe definitely attained via a top 6 finish, David O'Leary marks his 43rd birthday with the visit of Valencia to Elland Road in the Champions League semi-final. Valencia were in a similar bind to Leeds. They hadn't sewn up qualification back to the Champions League off the back of a spirited 3rd place finish the prior year. The one thing that did separate the 2 clubs, however, was Champions League experience. Until now, Leeds had none, whilst Valencia had gone all the way to the final in the previous season, in only their 2nd campaign in the competition. The match followed the pattern of Leeds creating half-baked shots with lots of possession, whilst Valencia looked for the high-value chances on the counter. Gaisca Mendieta came closest, hitting the bar with a header before the game swung on 2 goals that never were. Dominic Mateo's last gasp effort was clawed out by Santi Canizares on the line, whilst Valencia were similarly denied by a goal-line clearance. Although 0-0, it was a plan all but perfectly executed by Valencia manager Hector Cooper. With the second leg just 6 days away, Leeds had pressing matters to attend to back home, with the most important Premier League game remaining, Arsenal and Highbury. Unlike last season, Liverpool won at Bradford this time, with their superior goal difference propelling them into the top 3 to force a result out of Leeds. Theoretically at least, it was a perfect time to play Arsenal. They were also distracted by other competitions as they were to meet Liverpool in the FA Cup final the following weekend. Unfortunately for Leeds, they were destroyed once more at Highbury as Robert Pires ran the game and Freddie Ljungberg and Sylvain Wiltord bagged the goals. Leeds, though, could be construed as being unlucky not to get a point as Ian Hart's potential leveller hit the post. In the build-up to the Mestalla, Leeds were hit with the hammer blow of a UEFA review which slapped a 3-match ban on Lee Bowyer. The suspension wouldn't just rule him out of the semi-final, but the final two, should Leeds get there. Whilst Cooper concocted the perfect plan in Yorkshire, Valencia hadn't got the away goal, so a goal for Leeds would dramatically alter the tie. Valencia, however, hadn't conceded to English opposition at the Mestalla in the Champions League, stalemated twice with Manchester United before beating Arsenal 1-0. In fact, their home record in the Champions League was pristine, losing just 1 of 19 fixtures in the competition and hadn't been beaten in Europe at home whatsoever since Diego Maradona's Napoli thrashed them 5-1 in 1992. And since Leeds had beaten them 3-0 in the third round of the 1966-67 Fairs Cup, Valencia had won 11 and drawn 5 at the Mestalla against British opposition. The weight of history was against Leeds, and only 15 minutes were on the clock when Juan Sanchez stuck Valencia in front, likely with a little help from his hand. Yet still, Leeds sat 1 goal away from the Champions League final when the teams trotted out for the second half. 7 minutes later, that dream was trampled on as Sanchez added a second and Mendieta stuck a third in. More inspiring news back home, however, as Jimmy Floyd Hasselbank's double for Chelsea against Liverpool secured drop points for Leeds' Champions League rivals. And whilst Liverpool's FA Cup celebrations were only just dying down, Leeds' 6-1 pumping of Bradford kept the Champions League race right down to the final day. Liverpool were due in the capital to face surprise packages Charlton Athletic, whilst Leeds had the home comforts of a tie with mid-table Leicester City. If Leeds were to qualify for the Champions League, they needed the same types of favours they received from Bradford City last season. Unfortunately, they wouldn't arrive. Liverpool's nerves weren't allowed to get the better of them in the second half, as Robbie Fowler and Danny Murphy converged on a 5-minute double that ended Leeds' hopes. Both sides won, but Liverpool as Cup treble winners and Champions League qualifiers were the only winners, as Leeds geared themselves up for another run at the UEFA Cup and another outside shot at a title tilt. Leeds United had missed out on the Champions League, but what they wouldn't miss out on, according to Peter Ridsdale at least, were potential transfer targets because of it. Regardless, Frank Lampard's fee proved prohibitive, and only the loan sign and turn permanent of Robbie Keane had been added. The mood was further enhanced when Peter Ridsdale claimed supporters backed the decision to move from Elland Road to a site on the A1 ahead of the 2004-05 season. Funding for this would be procured from a sale of the naming rights. Because of fan sentiment and a stark lack of money, it never transpired. Yet on the pitch, Leeds were flying. A victory at Highbury as well as creditable draws at Anfield and Old Trafford were part of an 11-match unbeaten run to start the season. In the latter draw away to Manchester United, Leeds came achingly close to a first win at the ground since 1981, but for Ryan Giggs' late equaliser they would have done too. However, there was an air of luck about the result come the final whistle. Robbie Keane ought to have been sent off and Ole Gunnar Solskjaer could have completed the turnaround in stoppage time, 1999 style. Then the topic of David O'Leary becoming the successor to Sir Alex Ferguson forced its way to the topic of conversation. Sir Alex had announced his end-of-season retirement. Before speculation was allowed to rumble on, the Old Trafford manager quashed it by U-turning on his decision and remaining at the club for another 12 years. Meanwhile, O'Leary was quick to tie himself to Leeds with an eerily pertinent quote. "We've built something good here, and the only way it can go wrong is if it self-destructs from within." Off the back of good performances and the added bonus of a 4th Champions League spot becoming available via the league, Leeds spent big. The near £25 million double splurge on Seth Johnson and Robbie Fowler was completed in the winter. The former would come to be the lightning rod through which all transfer criticism flowed through. Although underperforming and riddled with injuries, it ultimately wasn't the former Derby County man's fault. Peter Ridsdale, who was quickly acquiring the nickname Father Christmas, fumbled the negotiations on the deal to bring Johnson to Elland Road in a huge manner. For a player on £5,000 a week wishing to treble his income, Seth Johnson and his agent couldn't believe the first figure slapped onto the negotiating table. £30,000 a week was Ridsdale's offer, a number that Johnson's agent managed to milk a further £7,000 out of. The whole thing was a farce, right down to the extortionate fee that Leeds were willing to pay for a perfectly serviceable, if unspectacular, midfielder. It was more than what Chelsea had doled out for World Cup and Premier League winner Emmanuel Petit, more than what Arsenal had paid for Gio van Bronckhorst, and more than the fees that were commanded for such stars as William Gallas, Edwin van der Sar and Zlatan Ibrahimovic that season. The unbeaten run soon morphed into 3 wins from 11 before Christmas, despite Robbie Fowler getting off the mark with a match-winning double at home to Everton for his new club. When questioned about how much Leeds were spending at that year's AGM, Ridsdale offered reassurances, stating, "You're bored of managing the club for sustained success, and that the club's long-term financial position is healthy." Yet it wasn't. Yes, Leeds United were well entrenched in the Champions League picture and favourites alongside Arsenal, Liverpool and Manchester United to qualify for the competition. However, the gap that split leaders Newcastle United and 8th place Aston Villa before Christmas was down to just 6 points. Compounding this was a last-minute Nobby Solano winner after Leeds had led 3-1. The next time the Whites suffered league defeat came in the reverse fixture 3 weeks later, which irrevocably reversed Leeds' fortunes. 3 victories without the concession of a goal buoyed Leeds United to the top of the Premier League with 17 games to play. However, with 4 of the top 6 to come and the top 5 split by 3 points, Leeds' season quickly unravelled. They scored twice, let in 10 and finished the run of difficult fixtures 9 points off the pace of leaders Manchester United. The seeds of the collapse could be sown from action taken off the pitch yet again. The trial that heavily featured Lee Bowyer, Jonathan Woodgate and Michael Dewberry, that required the trio to be at Hull Crown Court for every single day of proceedings, was finally concluded. It found only Woodgate guilty of a fray with his teammates not guilty of their respective GBH and perverting the course of justice charges. Despite this, all 3 were fined heavily by David O'Leary. Lee Bowyer rejected this reaction and consequently found himself placed on the transfer list. Sensationally compounding all of this was the release of the haphazardly titled Leeds United on Trial, written by David O'Leary, a title that not even Peter Ridsdale approved of. The publication was accused of pulling the curtain back a little too much on the club. And also when you consider that David O'Leary turned up to 1 Premier League contest with 2 black eyes after the result of plastic surgery to his nose, and it is easy to see how invited the criticism that he had taken eyes off the ball. They were out of the cup, losing embarrassingly to Cardiff City, and 3 more draws on the spin left a gaping chasm of 10 points back on Newcastle United for the 4th Champions League spot. Their elimination from the last 16 of the UEFA Cup thanks to a 90th minute PSV Eindhoven winner courtesy of Jan Vennegaard of Hesselink was supposed to remove all distractions. Then came the ire of the fans, who felt Brian Kidd's promotion from academy to the senior squad undermined club legend Eddie Gray's position as assistant manager. It prompted David O'Leary to return to training alongside Kidd and Gray before publicly admitting that his players had gotten away with too much. It was as if a magic wand had been waved. Leeds conspired to cobble together 3 wins in a row, shrinking the gap to 2 points from a faltering Newcastle. Then Easter turned up and Leeds' Champions League chances died, never to be resurrected. They were outclassed at home to Manchester United, the 4-3 scoreline doing them all kinds of favours after scoring 2 late on, before a 2-1 defeat at White Hart Lane 2 days later. Then the icing on top of the cake that summed Leeds' second half of the season up, Jonathan Woodgate's ruling out for the rest of the season with a broken jaw after a night out in Middlesbrough. For a man supposedly on his last warning, he was let off the hook as O'Leary chose to accept Woodgate's wafer-thin version of events. The professionalism and discipline at the club had officially dissipated. Far worse was David O'Leary's summation of the situation. He declared that Newcastle and Chelsea were only above them given their spending power. This simply ignored the fact that since O'Leary took charge at Elland Road, Leeds had a bigger net spend than the two combined. Only Manchester United had spent more in the same time frame, and this was largely the work of their two most recent signings, Juan Sebastian Veron and Ruud van Nistelrooy, costing a combined £50 million. The realities of the game, as Sir Alex Ferguson noted 4 years previously, had changed David O'Leary. They'd win 4 of their last 5, not conceding any of their wins, but it was far too late, as a win over Borough on the final day confirmed the minute consolation of 5th. The subsequent summer couldn't have gone much worse. Lee Bowyer was returned to the transfer list after a rejection of a new contract 12 months out from his expiration, before turning a £9 million move from Liverpool down because it didn't feel right. By this point, Leeds were desperate for the money, although they weren't ready to accept it yet. David O'Leary told the board that Champions League qualification wouldn't be possible if they sold club captain Rio Ferdinand to Manchester United. He was then promptly sacked, Rio Ferdinand was sold to Manchester United, and the £15 million worth of debt was apparently more than serviced with the £30 million sale. But the debt was not serviced. With a short list that read like a who's who of football management, from Gus Hiddink and Martin O'Neill to Steve McClaren and Marcelo Bielsa, Peter Ridsdale uttered the quite frankly unbelievable quote when he described their new manager as the best they could have possibly got. That man was Terry Venables. If a managerial star could fall so far in 6 years, it would be scarcely believable. After leaving England with the conclusion of a successful Euro 96 and credit in the bank in the form of QPR, Barcelona and Tottenham Hotspur wedged into his back pocket, Venables took on the mantle of Australia. He ought to have taken them to France 98, but blew a 2-goal lead against Iran. Then he left. He joined Crystal Palace, and 6 months later they were in administration. Then he left. Next up, a co-stint at Middlesbrough with Brian Robson in the Premier League. 6 months later, Teesside was apparently too remote for Venables. Then he left. Here he was now at Elland Road. Even the least experienced on that aforementioned shortlist of 4 managers, Steve McClaren, would go on to take lowly Middlesbrough to a European final. Gus Hiddink and Martin O'Neill were experienced operators that would improve the club, and Marcelo Bielsa, well, Leeds fans would belatedly come to know all about him. If that succession plan was a PR disaster, then the appointment of Max Clifford for £120,000 a year offered the exact wrong kind of PR when appointing a man who was supposed to control the club's PR. However, they had escaped the summer without a full-blown exodus. From an optimistic standpoint, only Robbie Keane had joined Rio Ferdinand in departing Elland Road, and they were the 2 areas in which they were well stocked. Add in the return of Stephen McPhail to the midfield and a rare, astute, cheap move in the market for Nick Barmby, and Leeds were certainly amongst contenders for Champions League qualification. Marked at 16-1 odds to win the Premier League, Leeds would end up a lot closer to relegation, priced significantly higher at 100-1. The Terry Venables reign, meanwhile, started perfectly with a 3-0 victory over the newly promoted Manchester City. Venables even achieved something David O'Leary never could. He beat Manchester United. The 1-0 triumph ought to have been the springboard to a suddenly middling season. Instead, Leeds won just once in the next 13 games, were eliminated out of the League Cup by Sheffield United and out of Europe by Malaga, with Nigel Martin and David Batty ostracised from the squad. With a top 4 finish dead, so was the dream. Lee Bowyer, Jonathan Woodgate, Olivier Dacourt and Robbie Fowler all left within a month for just £20 million when £80 million needed to be raised. In the other direction, a cataclysmically bad Raul Bravo was loaned in. Then, the press conference to end all press conferences was called.
Should we have spent so heavily in the past? Probably not, but we lived the dream.
And you heard the man, probably not. Understatement of the century. Leeds United had ruined the dream of Howard Wilkinson, the man who delivered Leeds' last league title, the man who set plans in motion to give the club a burgeoning academy that populated the youth that made David O'Leary's team so vibrant. With each excessive million spent on players that either didn't fit the system or weren't good enough, Leeds United lost a little bit of their identity. It is down to this and this alone as to why Leeds United failed. Not through the misfortune of their endless injury heartaches or the fortunes of others. Leeds United died because they overfaced themselves in the transfer market, because they sunk themselves into a £60 million hole against future gate receipts. They bet the house on consistent Champions League qualification that, until then, had only been the purview of Manchester United. The comparisons between some of Manchester United's greatest teams, the Busby Babes and the class of '92, were dirtied by the rash signings more comparable to a pound shop Galactico's enterprise. As such, Leeds United only narrowly avoided relegation in 2003 and the fire sale continued. Harry Kewell and Nigel Martin departed, and by the time of their relegation the following year, the team was barely recognisable, with the club skirting on the edge of administration. By the end of Leeds' first season back in the Football League, there remained only Gary Kelly, Lucas Radebe and Eric Bakker, when the dream of a Champions League final was only 90 minutes away. Halfway through the first consolidating season back in the Football League, Leeds United was saved by Ken Bates' £10 million takeover of the club as it neared total extinction. Yet debt spiralled under Bates, a man who previously said he wouldn't rest until Leeds United were kicked out of the Football League. Finally, he put the club into administration. David O'Leary meanwhile muddled through a comparatively uninspired 3 years at Aston Villa before, much like Don Revie, took a windfall from the United Arab Emirates by ending his managerial career at Al Ahly. Peter Ridsdale continued to work in football, winding up orders at Cardiff City, placed Plymouth Argyle into administration where he didn't pay staff for 10 months, before a short-lived spell at Preston North End saw him sack Phil Brown after 8 days. Leeds United cycling through managers wouldn't stop when they were relegated to the Football League. Kevin Blackwell initially steadied the ship and threatened to take Leeds back up in 2006, but a Champions League playoff final loss to Watford, combined with a dull brand of football, saw his exit in September 2006. A wildly unpopular Dennis Wise oversaw a relegation to the third tier for the first time in the club's history. A points deduction hamstrung the club, as well as Gary McAllister in his return to the club in a brief spell as manager. The club's cursed playoff record continued through 2008 and 2009, losing a final to Doncaster Rovers before a semi-final against Millwall. Simon Grayson eventually got the club up and stabilised them in the Championship until poor form fetched him the sack in February 2012. Then the dark days continued. Whilst they wouldn't return to League One, Leeds finished between 13th and 15th in 5 successive seasons, and rattled through the managers at a rate of knots under Massimo Cellino. Neil Warnock and Brian McDermott were given 14 months each, until Dave Hockaday and Darko Milanic barely managed a dozen games between them. Neil Redfern and Uwe Rosler didn't last much longer, while Steve Evans failed to take Leeds back to the top half. Optimism returned with the appointment of Gary Monk and apparent qualification for the playoffs. They collapsed, and an approach from Middlesbrough ended his reign and the club's Premier League ambitions before Thomas Christiansen and Paul Heckingbottom muddled through another mid-table season. Then the light at the end of the tunnel, Marcelo Bielsa. Bielsa delivered brilliant football ingrained within a structure and philosophy that was non-negotiable for the Argentine. The legend that had followed him round thanks to the testimonials from the hottest managers in football willed Leeds back into the Premier League, blitzing the Championship at the second time of asking. And he didn't stop there, entertaining in the top tier just as he had done in the second, but after relegation earlier on this summer, Leeds now face a somewhat gentler crossroads than they did in 2004. Just as the O'Leary era washed over and he was replaced by a new landmark at the club full of them, so too will the Bielsa era be succeeded with different excitements.